All right, come on, let's go. We're going to be late.
I'm coming. I'm just putting on my shoes, but which ones?
The pink Converse.
No, it'll be too much with this outfit.
Well, then the navy blue ones. Come on, hurry up.
James, you can't always be in a hurry. Sometimes you just have
Sometimes you have to hurry up. The pre-release starts in 20 minutes and we live 20 minutes away. We still have to park, then walk to the store. Do you see why I prepared for this?
How exactly did you prepare for this?
I did things that would speed up the process of leaving the house.
And those things were?
Well, I chose my outfit before bed, I packed my bag before bed, I prepared an efficient breakfast, and I just moved my body quickly. Can you put your shoes on any slower?
James, you are wearing the same clothes you wore yesterday, and I'm pretty sure you slept in them. Your bag was packed because you never unpack it, your so-called efficient breakfast was coffee, and your body is moving quickly probably because you backed that coffee up with a Red Bull.
Yeah, but I'm not the one that's late. It's quite a true reflection of us trying to leave for the game store. That's quite accurate.
It's we always joke about the skit verse being true, but that's pretty
really
close.
Really hit home.
In many ways. Welcome to the Get Commanded podcast. It's the GCP, brought to you by POG, Palms Off Gaming, sponsor of this podcast, where your mileage will vary. I'm your host, Walt.
And hello, Commander players. And I forgot. I'm James.
I forgot.
I just
forgot.
I was. Yep.
You forgot. I forgot. You forgot.
Something I did remember.
Sure.
And thankfully I do remember this because I'm the one responsible for booking all of this in. Before we get to the transmission, we stream every Monday night on Twitch, as you should very well know by this point. But this month, we actually have a pretty fun month of streaming coming up because of some guests we've got coming onto the stream.
Yeah, I did hear about this.
Yeah, on Monday, this coming Monday, by the time you're listening to this episode, so it'll be the 16th, we've got the one, the only Attack on Cardboard joining us, which is so exciting.
Finally good to get another showdown with Tom after I hosed his Stellar Lee deck back a few months ago now.
Well, it was kind of like his Stellar Lee deck hosed all of us, and then you just hosed Tom.
Yeah. Even hosed sounds kind of inaccurate when the deck just stopped him from being able to kill me. Yeah. Just turtled up.
Stacks. Gotta love it. But also, Attack on Cardboard also has a really fun Savine the Chronoclasm deck, so there's an idea that we might do a who can build Savine better, Get Commanded or Attack on Cardboard.
That's fun.
And then not only one, but we actually have two content creator features on our stream this month. We're going to have the wonderful Nigel from the Cozy Magic Club joining us as well.
Oh, awesome.
That'll be much later on in the month. That one's on the 30th. So
Nigel's the only member of the main Cozy Magic team I haven't met. So I'm really...
in person? Yeah,
I've
true.
still yet to meet Nigel in person, so that'll be good. I'll meet him virtually, at least.
Yeah. And you'll get to do the most important thing, which is play a game with him, which is the most accurate representation of who you are and how you play a game with Commander. It's kind of like a mini social experiment, isn't it, playing a game with Commander?
It's true. You sort of get to know all the weird tricks and things that people do when they engage in social gatherings.
And whether or not they break a deal.
Yeah.
Whether they prioritize removal or the fun thing.
Fun thing. Yeah. It's always the fun thing, as you'll discover, Nigel. But yes, that's it. That's really exciting. You definitely want to follow us. Twitch.tv/GetCommanded if you don't already follow us. Monday nights, you're going to want to join us.
7 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time.
That's it. But we have an incoming transmission from the deep depths of the galaxy, from the Space Commanders. It's time to get commanded.
Ramp allows game-winning spells before the expected moment, so Commander players should give careful consideration to the amount, kind, and synergy of the pieces that they include.
Another deck building principle episode.
Yeah.
We've done card draw, we've done win cons enhancers.
We've
now
done
we're doing
removal way
Yep.
back when. It wasn't called deck principle removal at the time.
been renamed now.
It has
I think.
been renamed, yes.
But yeah, this is the probably second most commonly talked about number in our template other than card draw, I would expect. This is like
probably
the second one.
The second most important as well,
Yeah.
probably after card draw. But yeah, it's good to finally hone in on ramp. It's something we've alluded to a few times, especially when we talk about mana curve. We talk about the relationship between those two things. We talked about Timmy's the other day.
Yeah,
we spoke about ramp.
That's
a bit.
a ramp-heavy
Yes.
archetype of a player. That's
Yes.
true. I think that card draw is something that people really talk about and kind of like extrapolate a lot. Whereas ramp is like, I think commonly people tick the box for like 10 pieces of ramp and then move on. But like if you give it a second thought, there's so much more about ramp that can be unpacked. I mean, the Space Commanders talked about the kind of ramp, the synergy of ramp, and I think that's like going to be the kind of structure of this episode is like how we're going to unpack this, because we're not just going to say like, all right, 10 pieces of ramp and you'll be done.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the end of the episode. Thanks for listening, everyone.
No, it's important. And there's lots of other things that we will, I'm sure, be looking at, like the mana value of the thing that we ramp with. And yes, what the kind is going to be a big one for sure. For the uninitiated, we should probably just define ramp for
Yes,
you
that's
all.
true.
So we recommend in our template, our deck building template, we do recommend 10 pieces of ramp. I think technically the number we've sent through is 0 to 10.
Yeah, I think it's very a guideline heavy number.
Yes, but
it does change deck to deck.
Yeah, I think in general, like if someone was like, how many pieces of ramp should I play? And they were a new player, we'd probably just say 10. But yes, it's just a guideline. Anyway, ramp is just any spell that will accelerate the amount of mana that you would usually have access to on any given turn. So if you play Rampant Growth on turn 2, this is probably the origin of the word ramp, by the way, and as long as you hit your third land drop, it means on turn 3, you'll have 4 mana, where if you had just played a land every turn, you'd instead just have 3 mana on turn 4.
And just for making 100% sure if we've got any brand new listeners, because this is something that is very commonly misunderstood, mana fixing, such as casting a spell like Sylvan Scrying, which is search your library for a land and put it into your hand, is not ramping. That is fixing.
Yes.
Same with spells like Land Tax. Very strong spell.
Yeah.
Granted, it always makes you hit your land drop. It's great in mono white.
Yeah.
It is not ramping you.
No.
You will still have the same access to the same amount of mana as you would if you just hit all of your land drops on every turn.
They're still really valuable things. Like, you know, we have recommended Sylvan Scrying before when people are playing decks that really need a particular land or particular lands in their hand. But yes, it's not ramp. You're not ending up with any more mana than you otherwise would, unless, I guess, you grab your Gaia's Cradle.
Yeah, I guess
But
that
if
could be a ramp in that case.
You're allowed to tag Gaia's Cradle as a ramp spell in your deck. We'll give you permission
Same with
to do
Cabal
that.
Coffers. I reckon that counts
that's
too.
True. That's true.
Yeah, there's a couple of like lands you could get with Sylvan Scrying that could result in you ramping, but casting the
even an
spell
Ancient
itself,
Tomb, right? But
yeah,
yes,
true.
But the spell itself
Yeah.
is not ramp. We would not tag Sylvan Scrying as a piece of ramp in our Moxfield list.
Yes, but the Space Commander did say the right amount, the right kind, and the right synergistic pieces. So I think that's how we should break down this episode. And I think we should start with the amount.
Yeah.
I think that's a kind of easy place to start. So we generally say, I know in our deck building template we say even 0 to 10, but usually the kind of off the cuff recommendation is 10.
Yeah.
That's like the minimum for any deck.
I think we wanted to acknowledge that some people who know a lot might be able to go lower than 10. But yes, in general, in a vacuum, we recommend 10. It makes sure that most of your relevant spells are cast on the turn that you kind of need to cast them, and that you get to the harrowed land of casting multiple spells in a turn, right?
Yeah.
You want to get to that double spelling turn, ideally on turn 4 or 5.
That's really important. I think that when we recommend 10, especially to new players, we recommend it because those double spell turns are really crucial for someone's enjoyment of the game. Because sometimes you can go, oh, I have to cast this removal spell, but that'll be my whole turn doing that if I choose to do that on turn 4, because I've only got access to 4 mana. Whereas on turn 4, if I had access to 5 or 6 mana, I might be able to go removal spell and this relevant 3-drop body that is going to progress my board state.
Yeah, or a ramp spell.
Yeah, or another ramp spell, and then on turn 6, you've got way more mana.
Yeah, exactly.
But look, this will change deck to deck. I think that obviously a huge part of deciding how much ramp we want to include in our deck is the mana curve. That is like the big thing that will affect our kind of number of the amount that we'll put into our deck.
Yeah. I think we could point you again to episode 25 of our podcast, Mana Curvy, long time ago now.
It's probably worth a revisit at
Probably
this point.
at some point. It's funny. I think Mana Curve comes up fairly often in passing as we cover other things that the Space Commanders want us to talk about.
We've pointed to that episode
We
quite
do,
a few times.
And you're right. It's probably often enough that we should revisit it at some point. But yes, your Mana Curve will have a big effect on how much ramp you need, because if you have spells that cost heaps and heaps of mana, you will need a lot more ramp than a deck that has mostly spells that cost, 3 mana or less.
I mean, regarding the scale, it's kind of easy to figure out, right? Like, the higher your mana curve, the more ramp you'll need to support that strategy.
It's pretty intuitive.
Yeah.
It's not something that requires a ton of thinking about. If you have like 10 6-drops in your deck, you probably just need more ramp than the average deck.
Yeah, because it will suck sitting there for like 6 turns just playing a land with, all these 6-drops and 7-drops in your hand stranded until that turn while everyone else has cast 7 spells by this point already.
Definitely.
I think another really, really big part of, like, another variable that changes how much ramp we can include in a deck or how much we should include is actually card draw. When decks ramp a lot, decks that do want to ramp a lot, what I've found is that they empty their hands really, really quickly without making much of an effect on the board state in regards to winning the game, right?
Yeah,
so, like,
yeah.
they might have, like, 30 mana rocks on the table, or they might have, like, 100 lands, but then they have no cards in hand.
And nothing to do.
Nothing to do with it. They're not swinging with any big creatures. They're not doing anything. So card draw is really important to refill that hand.
Yeah.
So you get the relevant spells to cast with all that extra mana that you've got.
I mean, it's also like we spoke about before with the rampant growth scenario. On turn 3, if you don't hit your 3rd land drop, you won't have ramped, really, will you? Like,
That's true, yeah.
If you ramp and then miss your land drop, you actually just spent mana to do the thing you should have done anyway, right? Like,
Yes.
it's worse than just hitting your land to cast rampant growth on turn 2 and miss your 3rd land drop, because you could have cast a removal spell on turn 2 and hit your 3rd land drop instead. So yeah, card draw is really going to matter, because the ramp only really matters when you're also playing your land every single turn, really.
Yeah, I guess that, like, the key differences of, like, what a deck should look like between, like, a high amount of ramp and a low amount of ramp is a deck with a high amount of ramp should have, like, well, it should have that higher curve for the big payoff for all that extra mana, but it should also have extra card draw in that kind of, like, burst card draw category, where it can draw a lot of cards all at once. Things like Return of the Wild Speaker is a kind of key thing. This is also, like, a great example of, like, a high mana value piece of card draw that draws you a lot of cards.
Yeah.
Even a Mind Spring, an X spell, that scales really nicely with how much mana you've got.
Yeah.
Just to refill your hand with relevant spells to cast with all of that extra mana you have.
Yeah, I find, like, in my Kaza Wizards deck, for instance, this is the deck where you tap Kaza, reduces the cost of the next spell you cast for the amount of
that
wizards.
kind of ramps you.
Yeah, well, basically. But yeah, it reduces it for the amount of wizards that you control. And yeah, like, I don't really run very many of these kind of, like, whenever you do blah, blah, sorry, I'm thinking card draw. Oh, no, card draw. Yeah, of course, yeah. But yes, there's very high density of X spells in there, because you can just draw like 10 cards at once, and then you're set, Yeah. And it's because you ramp into it. Yeah.
And because I think, because your commander is ramping you, because that, I would consider that like a high ramp deck, because one of the ramp pieces is in
Kaza.
your command zone, and that's a really big thing.
Definitely.
I think a smaller amount of ramp deck would look a little bit different. Usually it would have a lower mana curve, and it would be supported by much lower mana intensive card draw, like your Faithless Lootings, your Ponders. And this is to ensure that you are hitting every land drop to make sure you're still kind of going on curve. And when you do hit those, small pieces of ramp, you are still being able to cast them and, like Walt said, hit your land drop and make that ramp actually ramp, not just keeping you up to date with how much money you should have.
But it's also just, how much money you have access to, right? Like, your ramp should only be, and the card draw and stuff that you include should be reflective of how much mana you have access to, right? You don't want to devote, half or 3/4 of all of your mana that you spend across the game to drawing cards or to doing that sort of thing, if you don't have very much mana in the first place. You want it to be 20%, 10% maybe of the mana that you spend on those kinds of things. So yeah, lower mana value things like these 1-drops, Faithless Looting Ponder, Preordain, Brainstorm, all of the blue cantrips.
Yeah, anything that says target creature gains haste and draw a card, even on like in the red category or white category, gain protection, draw a card.
Yeah.
Like, all of that stuff is really, really crucial because you can use it just to filter out to make sure you're hitting those land drops.
Yeah, big time.
Now, look, I did open this command early.
Okay.
And I did some spreadsheeting.
Uh-huh.
And I looked at our decks.
Okay.
I did our typical thing with these deck building principle episodes and made sure that we have some stats to go alongside. And also just to prove that we are taking our own advice, really.
Sure.
So
I feel like this is probably the next bit of merch, in the pipeline for the way in the future. But there needs to be something that just says like the stats or something. And then me and James like pointing at it like we do in all of our thumbnails.
Walt's average this and James' average slightly bigger or slightly smaller.
That's what it should be. It should be like amount of caffeine consumed in an average day. Walt's average, James' average.
Speed James moves on average. Or James's average BPM. So do you want to know the average
of course
of ramp? I used 10 of each of our decks, so we had like a reasonable kind of sample size of each.
Also makes stats easier, right?
Yeah, just
multiples of 10.
Yeah,
much easier.
Makes statistics easy to calculate.
Yeah.
So my average across 10 decks was 14.6 pieces of ramp in my decks.
This checks out. If you had asked me, I'm not saying this just because now I know. Seriously, if you asked me before this episode, how many pieces of ramp do you think James plays on average? I would have said 15.
You would have said 15?
I think just out the gate, I would just have thought in my head, I know that I play roughly 10, and I know James plays significantly more than me. There's probably decks that are higher than 15, decks that are lower than 15, but I would have probably guessed 15. I think.
It's usually guaranteed that my first turns 1 to 3 at least have a ramp spell.
Yeah.
Of some description.
And look, like there's something to be said about that consistency. Like you know what kind of spells you can cast on future turns when you know you will ramp, whereas around the 15 mark, you very, very rarely don't have ramp in an opening hand.
Mm-hmm.
Or, by the time you draw into turn 3, you've usually drawn one. But around the 10 mark, it can happen. And it does change what those early turns look like. Like sometimes you'll have 5 mana on turn 4, and that means you'll do this thing with your commander, and other times you won't, and you'll actually like have to quite drastically change your approach for those early turns as a result.
There's a game that we played at the Palms Off Gaming headquarters recently where I was playing Zaxara, and I didn't really draw any ramp, which is wild because that deck has a lot of ramp in it.
It's probably closer to the 20 mark, I would have thought.
It is, it's very, very high, which we'll talk about. But I didn't hit any ramp in that early game, and you kind of pointed out that this is an anomaly. Like a real standout that this deck didn't perform the way it's designed to, because it's designed to be able to have that much extra mana in the kind of mid game, and it just didn't. It was just hitting land drops.
It meant that the X spells that you cast, like you just were 3 or 4 mana less than you typically would be. And that made a massive difference. There was turns where you could have eliminated players if you had 2 or 3 more mana. So it matters.
So your average, you were pretty bang on. You're slightly above 10. 11.8 was your average across 10 decks.
Interesting.
And that was, by the way, your decks, because I've just disassembled a bunch of decks recently, so I only excluded like 2 of my decks.
Sure.
Your 10 decks that I sampled were your 10 most recent edits on Moxfield. Like I just went from like the top to the bottom.
Okay.
So it kind of included the most recent Barbala sagas, the Gandalfs, the Averna. Marin was not in there. So like that kind of range of decks.
That makes sense. That's interesting. I think if I had to guess, I reckon my like distribution is quite a bit wider than yours. Like even as you're reeling off decks, I know Barbala Saga is really low on ramp relative to a lot of decks. And then I also know that probably my last 10 would be Averna, which is closer to the 20 mark. So anyway, it's interesting. Like I think my decks vary quite widely, where some are really high, some are really low.
It's interesting you say that. I actually think from looking at the statistics, and by the way, patrons, I will be posting this spreadsheet up on Patreon, and it's as clean as I could get it. It's color-coded, has all the averages, the percentages, distribution. So you can go and check that out on Patreons. But I will say that I reckon my distribution, like my spread, was much more dramatic than yours.
Really?
Yours was much more concise. I was kind of shocked to see that you only had your kind of top end of your ramp decks topped out at like 15.
Yeah.
Mine topped out at like 20. And my lowest were about the same as yours, whereas my lowest was 9 and your lowest was 9.
Interesting.
So my spread was a bit bigger. Yours was a bit more concise, kind of within that 9 to 15. That was your bracket.
Interesting. That's not what I would have expected.
No. And I think there's something to say here about, you've already kind of touched on the fact that you kind of anticipated that I would have more ramp in my decks.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the type of player or the play style of any given player influences the amount of ramp people include in their decks?
Absolutely, it does. I think, I mean, I said this in the Timmy episode, funnily enough, but I think that you are a Johnny who pursues Timmy. Like,
I think I'm a Johnny that loves feeling like a Timmy.
well, I think you Johnny for a Timmy play. Like I think I said in that episode,
Yeah,
like
that makes
you do
sense.
the tap untap stuff is a really classic like Johnny and a classic James thing.
Yeah.
I tap this to untap this, which does this other thing, like, you know, sequence of things that makes this other thing happen. But then typically it's you do all of that to then cast this one big massive thing.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting. I think that rocks in particular really support this with you, where it's like you like to kind of like have all these options available to you, which a lot of mana gives you access to, right? You want to be someone who plays something on your turn and leaves up this fun answer for somebody else's turn. That requires a lot of mana. But also, yeah, a lot of the time you're doing all these Johnny combo things to cast a big spell. Like I think even when we looked at mana curve before, I think your average mana curve was often slightly higher than mine,
slightly
wasn't
higher.
it? Yeah.
Which is good to see, actually. It's kind of...
They align.
It's good to know that even though my mana curve is higher, I'm supporting that strategy with a higher amount of ramp.
It's a good thing. Otherwise, we'd be worried.
Yeah,
We'd
if
be
I
worried
was
about
like,
you.
if I was the same as you, but had a much higher mana curve, that would be kind of like warning bells in my head going off of like, I don't think I'm playing the right amount of ramp to support what I'm trying to do. And also, yeah, I completely agree with you with the Johnny combo thing. Like I run in my Zaxara deck Deserted Temple, which is a land it's a colorless land. You pay 1 and tap it and untap target land.
Oh, yeah.
So I've got lands that tap for multiple mana.
Yeah.
So if you use that, you can kind of generate a little bit of ramp just by untapping. It's like combo ramp, I guess.
No, it's cool.
I also wanted to ask, do you think that you build by the book? Because you are very close to our template and your average was 11.8, so you're very, very close. So do you think you are kind of building with the theoretically this is how every good commander deck should be built? So you always pick to that line? Because I'm curious, when you build a deck, when you're starting to put in the ramp, I'm not sure at what point in the deck building process you usually look at ramp, but when you are at that stage, wherever it is, the start or the end, are you thinking about... Well, you were obviously thinking about the mana curve and all that kind of stuff. Just take me through the process, because I'm really curious to know like why yours is quite dramatically lower than mine. Because for me, I'm like, I love big plays. Do you like little plays? Is that...
I think ramp, I would say, is a lot less important to me than how the rest of the deck is doing stuff.
Sure.
And so, to answer the first part of your question, ramp is last for me.
It's the last thing
It's
you
the
look
last
at.
thing I look before I start cutting cards. I don't ever like to cut cards down to 100 and then go, oh crap, I forgot ramp. Like I try to get absolutely everything in the deck that I could ever possibly need. Then I try and cut down to 100. So the ramp will be in there at that point. But yeah,
Sure.
I'll have added all the other cards I think are interesting, all my card draw, all my removal. I'll have all that in there, and then I'll go, oh, and I'll just get my ramp count high enough now.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think, to be honest, it's probably that process that gets me so close to 10 so much of the time. Because when I'm cutting cards from my deck, because my mana curves often end up reasonably low, ramp's not that important, and it's not something I feel strongly about.
It's like
and
the afterthought.
And it's kind of the easiest cut for me. Like, I don't
Sure.
cut lands. I've learned that lesson.
Yeah. Every commander
yes.
player has been through that exact lesson.
Yeah, but I think because I've had so many decks that I've gone down to about 10 ramp in, and because the mana curve's been low, because the card draw amount's been high, I haven't noticed a real absence of enough ramp. I think I've just stuck close to that number. I haven't felt the need to deviate far from it. I definitely have it in my head. Like, I'm thinking 10 in my head. I'm like, is this a 10
That's your
deck?
number.
Is it going to go lower? Is it going to go higher? But I'm shooting for 10. Like, that's my starting point. But then, yeah, I don't feel that strongly about where I end up. And so a lot of the time I'm just looking at the curve and going, well, I'd much rather cast all of these other 2 drops than a rock. So I guess I'm cutting these 5 rocks from the deck.
That makes a lot of sense. Look, I pulled out some case studies for both high mana ramp amount of decks and low mana amount of ramp decks. And I think what we should do when we look at these decks, we should ask ourselves, why do we run that amount? We should answer that question. And then do we think it's currently correct to be running that much? So the case studies for high, I pulled 2 for each of us.
Sure.
My high decks were Phylaf, which had a total of 19 pieces of ramp, which makes a lot of sense because it's a landfall, deck. So we want the Cultivates, we want the Farseeks, all that kind of stuff. I also had Zaxara, which I said was high. It's a 20.
Yeah.
It is a 20 piece of ramp deck, which makes sense. The whole point of the deck is big mana.
Yeah.
Your 2 highest decks, these were just the 2 that are at the top of the curve. Rith was a 15.
Right.
And Averna was a 15.
Interesting.
So that was the top. That was as high as amount of ramp as you get.
Wow.
Do you think that's the right amount for those decks? And do you think that you need more? Do you need less? Were you overcompensating for what you thought the deck was going to be?
I think Rith has felt exactly right. That every time I've played Rith, like obviously having a commander in the command zone that costs 6 mana, that has an ability that costs mana to activate.
You want a lot of mana available to you.
You just got to have it. Like, and most of the time, like you cast Rith, and that next turn you kind of want to cast 1 more spell at least and activate Rith.
So on like turn 6, you want to have 8 to 9
8 or 9 mana is really good. And a lot of the really efficient and repeatable ways to make tokens, because it's a token deck, do cost quite a lot of mana. And there's a lot of mana sinks with things like Sprout Swarm in the deck. There's the March of the Multitudes. Like, yeah, I think 15 has felt right. I think there's a world where you could maybe play slightly more, but the deck has functioned totally fine with 15.
Sure.
Averna's interesting. Like, theoretically, this number should be closer to your Phylaf deck, right? Which is 19, because this is my landfall deck.
It's a landfall deck.
But Averna, it makes you hit lands explicitly, right?
Yeah,
that's the thing she does.
Pulling them from exile while you're cascading, which is like kind of ramping you. And again, this is the difference between a commander in the command zone that ramps you and a commander in the command zone that pays you off from ramping. Like, Phylaf is a payoff, whereas Averna is a enabler. It is a ramp piece.
Yeah.
And that we spoke about that in the last deck building principle and the win cons and enhancers and like the role of your commander.
The role of your commander. It's a huge thing. Yeah. I think with Averna, like, if you said it's a lands deck and didn't tell someone what the commander was and said you're running 15 pieces of ramp, someone would justifiably go, I think that number should be higher. But when you read Averna and it's like, literally all she does is ramp you. Like, she doesn't do anything else. You have to already be cascading and then she lets you ramp. And so it's like, I've found with Averna that having enough cascade cards in your hand is crucial, obviously.
Because Averna, for those that don't know, whenever you cascade, you may play a land.
You can put a land card from among the exiled cards onto the battlefield.
Yes, and that happens before the spell happens, which is interesting.
It's very weird.
So you
cascade, you find the thing that you will cast, or you're about to decide if you're going to cast it, and that's when you pick the land, and then you choose whether to cast the thing. It's all very strange timing. I'm sure the rules have to make it that way.
What Walt's trying to say is don't respond at any point while he's cascading because it will confuse the rules.
Yes.
Just let Walt cascade, then he'll say, all right, now I'll pass priority now.
Now
you can do
your stuff. Yeah. I think in terms of your 2 decks, I mean, Phylaf, I think 19, that sounds right.
Yeah.
It's a ramp deck. And honestly, Zaxara is the same. I think because you are an X spell deck specifically, and you have so many of the X card draw spells. And so, like, there's a really satisfying thing I know from my Kaza deck, which is a similar thing. You can have one of those X card draw spells in your opening hand, and you can just empty your hand over turns 1 through 5. You can put every ramp spell onto the board. You can develop your board with all these creatures, and then just the last spell you cast is Mind Spring with X equal to 10.
And as long as that's...
I'm set.
And as long as it doesn't get counted, I am good.
Yeah,
It is really, really strong. I think that Phylaf is an interesting one when I looked at it, because I think the fact that it's a payoff in the command zone for having a lot of land specifically is like a big part of why the ramp is so, like, there's so much in abundance.
Yeah.
I think the landfall thing is like kind of the secondary part.
Yeah.
I think the making the plants is such of like the big thing that I focus on with
Sure.
it. So a lot of my ramp is getting basics to the battlefield. So when Fire Life
Yes.
enters, I make a bunch of basics, and then later game, to be honest, because when a land enters with Fire Life, you put 4 counters on it. Honestly, that's enough if you just hit your land drop from every turn for their 4th.
You don't necessarily need to hit a bunch more land drops after Fire Life has come
No.
in. It's more about getting all those plants in the first place.
And the way I kind of run the deck is I try and go like get as much tokens as possible so I can sack them to Goblin Bombardment or use Xenagos as another ramp piece to uptick Xenagos to then generate a ton of mana with all the tokens. I think it's an interesting balance of what I'm looking for with that kind of payoff.
It's interesting as well. I think that Fire Life, a lot of the time, the later stuff that gets you those landfall triggers is you do play Crucible of Worlds, Ramunap Excavator, Azusa. Like, you have a lot of ways to do the classic, like, fetch land in the bin, hit a bunch of land drops. There's like, there's, I think, multiple ways to hit every single one of those. You've got multiple get every land every turn, multiple play cards from graveyard, multiple fetch lands. Like, there's a lot of ways that you can end up with that scenario. And once you have it, like, you don't need more.
No,
like,
you don't need more ramp. You just need because at that point it's not ramp. It's not the ramp that you care about.
No, it's the
just
landfall.
the landfall that you care about.
Exactly.
So for the low amount of ramp decks, the decks that I pulled out for you was your Arami deck at a 9.
Yep.
And your Kaza deck at a 9. Which makes sense because Kaza is again a piece of ramp in the command zone.
Yeah. It's interesting with Kaza's really tough. Like, I've had to be really careful with ramp where it's really important that the ramp produces color specifically. Like, I play Arcane
The 2
Signet.
pips.
Kaza's not so bad to cast, but a lot of the time on the turn that you want to go off, you've got like a Comet Storm, or it's not Comet Storm in the deck anymore, but like a triple red spell
Like
in your
Storm
hand.
King's Thunder or something like that.
Yeah, but then you also have Dual Caster Mage, and it's like, man, I need 5 red. Like, I can reduce the X cost of this so easily with Kaza. I need every one of these pips. And anyway, the way that I've ended up landing on it is that I just try and hit a land absolutely every turn with heaps of card draw.
Yeah.
And then all of the ramp like produces color. So I've gotten rid of every single one of those cost reducing sort of things. From the deck. I used to have like wizards cost 1 less and spells cost 1 less. Most of that ended up being cut. But yeah, like I don't know. It's interesting. I could probably benefit from having slightly more, but you need wizards because wizards ramp you.
Yeah.
And so much of the time when I'm looking at the deck, I'm like, I'm at 30 wizards. So I could like put another ramp spell in, but I think the only way I could feasibly do that is to cut a wizard, and I'd rather have a wizard than a ramp spell most of the time.
But it's the reason why I found this one so interesting is because when you talk about Kaza, if you were to introduce it, you said this is my big spells deck.
Yeah.
And it's one of the lowest pieces of ramp decks that you have, which to me is like, it sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But again, this is where the role of the commander comes into it. The fact that Kaza is ramping you for every wizard you control is a huge part of why you can get away with just running 9 pieces in this deck.
And then in terms of around me, my other deck was 9. This is a pretty different reason as to why it's the way that actually it's pretty similar. Kaza wants to play really early wizards. Around me really, really needs to cast early spells that mill me. And so
I have a very similar example from my list.
Oh, yeah?
My Scarab God list was also at a 9.
Yeah. It's sometimes you look at a deck and it's like, yes, ramping and getting my commander out a little bit early might be good, but it's more important that I get everything set up for when the commander comes in. I think Scarab God and Arami are quite similar in that way. Well, they don't come out until you're ready for them to come out.
Interestingly, so many of the pieces of ramp that were in both of our Arami decks and Scarab God decks were identical.
Yeah.
We both ran Deranged Assistant.
Yeah.
We both ran Milliken.
Yep.
And we both ran just like a couple of talismans, a couple of signets.
Yep.
And that was it. That was kind of like the whole ramp package. And when you look at it, you go, okay, that makes a lot of sense because I think with Scarab God, for me, it might be a time to reflect on it a little bit, mainly because of how much mana I want available to me in the late game.
To activate the ability of Scarab God, yeah. I think that your deck is slightly different than Arami in that way, where you always have the ability to sink mana into something. Whereas Arami, like, yes, it can be nice to encore 2 things a turn, but you have to already untap Arami to do that. And most of the time, you just want to kind of like mill, do one big thing with Arami. And then, so much of the thing is that Arami can't come in until you have like, you need to have a creature that you want to encore,
Mm-hmm.
the mana to do it, and then so crucially, a bunch of other junk to throw away because you have to exile 3 cards from your graveyard every time you activate a Raumi. And yeah, the thing I found with the deck is it functions far and away better when there's about 25 ways to mill in a Raumi, and most of them are repeatable, like mill yourself every turn, tap it to mill a card, like this kind of stuff. Because
I think I was sitting at about maybe 12 or 13 pieces of mill in Scarab God.
Yeah.
Mine were a lot bigger than yours, I would say.
And you also mill everyone with some of them, like stuff like Mesmeric Orb.
Mesmeric Orb's a huge one.
Yeah,
and then like even, well, we've both got Consuming Aberration, but I was thinking of Mind Grind was the one I was thinking of, where everyone reveals until they revel X lands, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't play that card.
Yeah,
no.
it's the X spell where you reveal until you get X amount of lands, I think, and then you put all of those in the graveyard.
Yeah,
so sometimes you can mill like half of someone's life.
Yeah.
Pretty intense.
Well, Consuming Aberration is a similar thing. What was your other low deck?
My other low deck was Savine, and that also was at a 9.
Interesting.
And I think because I've been tinkering with that deck a lot, and I think I haven't been keeping track of ramp, and I think I've been removing pieces of ramp from my Savine deck, but I think it's still functioning because of how good the card draw is.
Yeah, it's interesting. It again seems similar to a Raumi and to Kaza, where there's so many other early things that you want to be doing.
I want to be developing like the bodies, like a young Pyromancer, or things like getting cards in the graveyard so I can cast them with flashback later in the game.
Just casting cantrips in Savine feels pretty good because you get them into your yard for use later when you hit your ways to give everything flashback in the bin. That seems kind of right to me, I think, with Savine. I think the one thing... Actually, because even then, I was going to say maybe sometimes you want Savine to come out early, but it's not that important, really.
No, my Savine deck is like a... Savine comes out when I've got something in graveyard that is relevant for me to cast that could really propel me to the winning state.
Usually takes you 4 to 5 turns anyway. So if you just
Usually 5 turns.
Yeah, if you cast Savine on turn 5... it's probably because you've actually developed really well into your graveyard. So
and I think
makes sense.
I think before we move on, I think that's one of the things that I really wanted to focus on, because we've spoken about it a lot, is like, what turn do you want your commander to come out?
Yeah.
It really dictates what ramp, and especially what mana value ramp you're including in the deck. So for example, the one that I point to all the time is 4 mana commanders. 4 mana commanders, all your pieces of ramp should be 2 CMC.
Yeah, assuming your 4 mana commander wants to come out as early as possible.
Yes.
It will mean that, when you cast that Rampant Growth on turn 2, as long as you hit that 3rd land drop, you are casting your commander on turn 3 a full turn early.
Yeah. So like the commander that I use is the kind of like my prime example is my Sally Sparrow deck.
Oh,
because Sally Sparrow is so crucial to the strategy of that. Like it is, as in terms of the role of the commander, it is an enabler commander. It enables the entire strategy to work.
You want Sally Sparrow to ideally be the first thing that comes out.
Except a 2 mana ramp
Yes,
mana rock.
aside
That's
from
like
that.
the first spell is a 2 mana ramp, and then the second spell is Sally Sparrow.
Yeah.
So I think that is like an obvious, real key thing to think about is what turn do you want your commander to come out on? That also will dictate what mana value your ramp should be. So for example, if you've got a 5 mana commander, you can look at a 3 mana ramp spell.
Yes.
But we've said this a million times before, 3 mana ramp spells, you really, really have to have a good reason to put them in. Because it's a lot of mana to kind of sink into just for the effect of ramping you.
Yeah, I think there are times where it can be really good. Like, for instance, in my Rift deck, I play Cultivate and Kadama's Reach, and it's because when you have a 6 mana commander, the ramp is obviously really important, but actually it's really important that you hit your next land drop as well.
Well, I think those two are like kind of my exception to the rule, because like they're always good because they always hit your next land drop.
Yeah. So you're thinking more of the kind, like, the monolith kind of rocks.
I'm thinking rocks,
3 mana rocks that just tap for 1.
A great example of a 3 mana rock that I really like and I run is Crowded Crypt. This is the 2 and a black, taps for a black, but then whenever a creature, I think you control dies. I'm not sure if it's anyone's creature dies, but whenever a creature, who controls it, dies, you put a crypt counter on it,
Something
or some
like
kind of counter,
yeah.
and then you pay, I think it's 6 mana, and sacrifice it, and you make a bunch of zombies equal to the number of counters on it. Like, that could be a game-winning activation in Scarab God in the late game.
There are a lot of these kinds of rocks being printed at the moment, and I really like them, and there will probably be one that is right for pretty much every deck that you build. When I build my Rift deck, there's a card. Oh, I'm forgetting the name of it. It's a white rock, so it taps for white, or you can pay a white and tap it, and the next spell you cast this turn has Convoke.
Oh, that's sweet.
And it's so good in a token deck. Like
that can ramp you way more than just one white mana.
Well, it's great as a ramp piece because it's always a rock. Like, it never goes below that. But, oh man, I'm forgetting the name of it. Anyway, but sometimes
we'll
it
look it
grabs
up
you
in
way
the
more.
interlude.
Yeah, we'll pull it up for you.
But I think like some other rocks that at 3CMC that I don't mind, I still run Chromatic Lantern in 3-color decks.
Sure, fixes all your lands.
Mainly in my Savine deck because it's so color pip intensive.
Yeah, sure.
I really like being able to just immediately fix my mana like that.
I like Worn Power Stone.
Worn Power Stone's pretty good.
In the right deck, I think especially ones where you have like a 5-mana commander. Worn Power Stone on 3 will let you cast a 5-mana commander on turn 4.
And probably another spell.
Yeah, it can be. Oh, I'm trying to think now. Does that... On turn 3, you had 3, and then you got 4, 5. Oh, yeah, you could. Yeah, you could cast a 5-mana commander and a 1-mana spell. Assuming you hit your land drop.
I also think that Patriarch Seal is a fantastic 3-drop ramp spell. This is the one that can untap a legendary creature as well.
If your commander has a tap activate ability that you would want to activate multiple times in a turn, just play Patriarch Seal. It is busted.
First card you should put in your deck is Patriarch Seal.
In fact, funnily enough, both Araumi and Kaza have Patriarch Seal in it because that makes sense, right?
Yep, I have a few Patriarch Seal in. I got one in Tornos. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. I think the amount of ramp you run in a deck, there are so many variables that play into it, but it's interesting that our averages were above 10.
Yeah.
I think that was something that I found interesting.
Yep.
But I think we're justifiably playing it, and as long as the listeners can hear that and go, okay, I can go up, but I need to be able to justify the reason why I've gone up.
Yeah, and you can go down too.
Yeah, you can go down.
You can absolutely go down if your curve is low enough and you've got great card draw. You know, you've got every blue cantrip. Like you can go lower than 10 as well. But yeah, like I hope that us telling you about our decks has made you go like, oh right, like there's reasons for the things that people do. Yeah,
but we've been talking for a while.
We have. I reckon it might be time for a thrifty interlude.
Yeah.
We've got lots left to talk about, including the kind of ramp and the synergy ramp, as the Space Commander said. But before that, let's hear a little something about a thrifty card. As is tradition, I'll be performing this week. It's the Cowled Merchant with some new wares. James, you want to read the card we're featuring this week?
Yeah. Infested Thrinax? Is that how you pronounce it?
That sounds right to me.
Thrinax?
Just looking at the word. I don't know. I would say Thrinax, I think.
Thrinax. I'm assuming it's a lizard. Anyway, it's 3 black and a green for a creature lizard 4/4 with flash. And when it enters, until end of turn, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a number of 1/1 green sapling creature tokens equal to that creature's power.
Ever wanted to call in sick? Want a few days off work so you can finally tend to your ant farm, but worried your workplace will demand a medical certificate? Then I'd like you to meet this really unwell lizard dog thing. She's got everything. Common cold, flu, fever, food poisoning, tuberculosis, a UTI, conjunctivitis, and worms. In fact, her worms have worms. They're smaller, more flexible, and they even wear little monocles. Just kidding. They wear prescription glasses. They got cataracts from the lizard dog. It hasn't been this much fun to get sick since your parents used to give you that sickly sweet cough medicine as a child. Yes, mother, I would like the nectar of the feral strawberry upon my tongue now, please. No, don't check my temperature, you sack of geese. I'll be terribly warm from my UTI worm fever. Get budgeted.
I swear, if I called into work sick with the excuse that my lizard dog thing gave
my
me
worms cataracts.
Yeah, gave my worms cataracts. I'm sure my boss would be like, can I have a vet certificate, please?
It's not very often that I read something that I've written and really go, I have no memory whatsoever of writing this, but...
Well, I swear to God, it's not you that writes it anymore.
No.
It is just the Cowled Merchant.
He takes over. When I'm writing, like...
It's like a possession.
Yeah. I seriously, like, sometimes I'm just like, okay, the Cowled Merchant's going to say something. Let's find out what it is. Thrifty Thursdays happens every week in our Discord server, so you can check out the dedicated channel, play some games, or get some advice on your latest tech. It's linked to the show notes.
Yeah, there's so many cool things going on in that server,
Yeah.
including Battlefront 2.
Oh my! After the last episode,
you guys really showed up and were like,
a lobby is gonna happen.
It's straight up gonna happen.
It's gonna happen.
I need to take, because I've got Battlefront 2 on like an external storage for my Xbox. I need to
Right.
now move it from that back
I have
onto
to
the main
reinstall
console.
it. I don't think I've got it installed on this computer.
Right. Well, we got to do it.
We got to
'cause,
do
like,
it. It's happening.
It was like 5 people in our Discord were like, yeah, downloading it now. And we're like, oh shit.
That's amazing. I would
can't
love
wait.
if we can get like a lobby where it's mostly us. I'm not going to pretend we're going to reach a level where the lobby is entirely
Especially not
us
the
and our
Galactic
listeners.
War
No,
version.
no,
Like, that's
I
like
think
a
that's 16
50
versus 16, I think.
I think it's bigger. I think it's like 20 versus 20. It's a 40-person lobby.
Oh, is it too? Yeah, and then there's a
Yeah.
bunch of AI as well. So it's
Yeah.
like, it looks more like 30v30.
It's a
but
Galactic War, yeah.
Yeah. It'd be great if we could have the whole lobby. I'm not going to pretend that's going to be possible, but if we could have a
Just a
team
party,
or
just like a
most
group, yeah.
8 or 9 of us, that'd be great. So yeah, hop in and play Battlefront 2 with us.
Not played it yet. It's a great game.
It's really good.
I'm sad it died. Anyway, we've got more ramp
Yeah.
stuff to talk about. Now, the Space Commanders did say the right amount, which we've covered, but then the right kind, which is the next thing that I wanted to go into. Now,
Yeah.
I'm assuming everyone's brain immediately went to, oh, they're going to talk about rocks and dorks and spells and stuff like that. Not yet. We'll get
Okay.
there. When I was looking at our decks, I found 3 very distinct categories of ramp, like the tag in which you would label this with as like a subcategory of ramp.
Okay, like if you were doing like ramp, comma this, ramp, comma this.
Yes, and there's like 3 key definitions of them, and we've actually
Sure.
covered a few of them in episodes before, but there's one that kind of came up that I was like, oh, that's new. So the first one is permanent based ramp. So
I suspect is the most common,
yeah,
right?
100%. This is ramp that, so we'll go through all the definitions. This is ramp that will accelerate you and usually, thanks Fast Mana, on following turns give you access to more mana than you would usually have and will remain on your battlefield as a source of mana. So for example, any of the Rakdos, Signets, Simic Signets, Is It Signets, that kind of stuff,
Yep.
a rampant growth, even a Finhorn Elves, like a Mana Dog.
Okay, so this is a very wide net we're casting with
Yes.
permanent ramp. We're talking about dorks, we're talking about ramp spells like rampant growth, farseek, that kind of thing, and even rocks. So
Yeah.
anything that stays on the battlefield and gives you that ramp every single turn, that's permanent.
Yes, and I say usually on following turns give you access to more stuff because there are things
Oh,
like
fast-
Soul Ring.
Fast mana gives you access to more mana on this turn.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it is still permanent. It still
Yes.
stays on your battlefield and gives you access to it on subsequent
Sure.
turns, right?
As opposed to
Burst ramp.
Yeah.
So burst ramp is something that we've talked about before, and a lot of people were like, oh, that's fast mana, right? No, burst ramp, by our definition anyway, is ramp that, again, usually ramps you the turn they are cast. And I say usually because there are some burst ramp spells that create tapped treasure tokens, for
Sure.
example. So that would ramp you in a burst way on the following turn.
But importantly, they're not giving you mana that sticks around, right?
It's temporary.
Even so, a Dockside Extortionist would be a great example of a burst ramp effect.
Yeah.
You can get more mana on the turn that you cast it and use it all that turn, but unless you flicker Dockside Extortionist, it's just that one time. You got your 5 treasures, your 6 treasures, that's it. You sack those treasures, you're done.
Yes, Jeska's Will, any ritual spell, Dark Ritual,
Yep.
Mana Geyser, all of that stuff is burst ramp.
Yep.
High Tide is burst ramp.
Till end of turn, when you tap islands, they produce twice as much blue. Yep.
Even stuff like Plasm Capture is an example of burst ramp. So
Sure.
this is kind of like the poor man's mana drain.
Yes.
This is green.
Very poor man's mana drain.
It's green, blue for a counter target spell. And
Yep.
then in the beginning of your next main phase, you add X mana of any color, where X was the mana value of the spell you counted.
Yeah, so if you counter a 5-drop, you can add 3 blue, 2 green, 5 blue, 5 green,
Yeah.
whatever you feel. Yeah.
It's pretty good, but like it is a burst piece of ramp.
Yeah.
It comes in a burst, gives you access to more mana than you should have, which is ramp, but it's only temporary.
It's just for that turn. Yeah.
You can kind of stockpile some burst ramp,
Yeah.
like with treasures and
Treasures
stuff
can.
like that,
Yeah.
but it is temporary.
Yeah.
Now, the third category that I identified, because we've spoken about those two before, but I've identified another category.
Sure.
And I'm going to call it repeatable.
Okay.
Repeatable ramp is ramp spells that are either permanent or temporary, but can be repeatably used to accelerate you on multiple turns.
Okay.
So, some examples of this are extra land drops.
Ah.
So, for example, Azusa Lost But Seeking, in my opinion, is repeatable ramp.
Right, but it's not something that's sitting on the battlefield giving you mana. It's like giving you repeated access to more mana,
or
potentially.
giving you more access to more ramp.
Yeah,
right. So like if
right.
you draw 5 cards and 3 of them are lands, you can play them again.
Yeah.
And that is like a ramp spell that you cast earlier in the game.
But it doesn't really qualify in that permanent category because it's not something that is itself making you mana. It's giving you access to more mana potentially.
Correct. Another example from one of my decks that I pulled out was Boxing Ring. This is a card from New Capenna. Whenever a creature enters, you get to have it fight something. So that's pretty cool. But then you can tap and create a treasure token as long as something fought something this turn.
Interesting.
So every turn you can create a treasure, which you can use that turn, or you could stockpile.
Yeah.
So do you see what I mean? It's like, it's not... Like, Boxing Ring isn't a burst piece of ramp.
No.
It's not a permanent piece of ramp.
It's somewhere in the middle.
It's kind of repeatably ramping you if you can get it to activate.
I'm thinking of Old Gnawbone as
Old
an example
Gnawbone
of
is
this,
repeatable
right?
ramp,
It stays on the battlefield, so it is permanent in that way, but it's just giving you repeated access to treasures. You get treasures repeatedly when you do certain things, but it's not itself a permanent that's giving you mana itself. It's like a trigger and stuff. I mean, even like a Smothering Tithe, right? Would be an example of this repeated thing. It's a permanent that sits there, but it gives you access to mana in intermittent doses across the game.
Yeah, I mean, you have Monologue Tax and Archaeomancer's Map, for example. They are repeatable pieces of ramp that ramp you maybe the turn they come down, but can also ramp you on subsequent turns in this kind of like incremental way.
Yeah.
And I found, interestingly, just looking across our decks, we'll get into it, but these usually were the most synergistic pieces of ramp.
Ah, that checks out.
Yeah.
I somehow, I think because a lot of them are triggers, they happen when you do something.
Or if you've done something this turn.
Then it makes sense that you tend to put them in a deck that can do that thing repeatedly.
So, I know you have all been waiting for it.
Yeah.
It's stats time.
Stats time.
Now, I will say that some cards can be repeatable with recursion or synergy with the commander. So, for example, like... for example, in my artifact deck, I can repeatably use Solemn Simulacrum.
Sure.
Because I can reanimate it, or like I can, keep copying the trigger or something like that.
Yeah.
But for the purposes of these stats, I've analyzed them on complete face value of the card.
Oh, okay. So Solemn, for instance, you would not count as a repeatable. You'd be counting that as burst. Because...
I would count it as permanent, actually, because it enters, gets a land, and then on subsequent turns...
Actually, that makes sense. It's more like a ramp and growth than
it's
like
more
anything
like a
else.
ramp and growth,
but it's not counting itself as repeatable. That makes sense, yeah.
But in decks,
it can be repeatable.
It can be repeatable.
Well, I mean, my Arami deck would be similar, right?
Yes.
Solemn would definitely be a repeatable thing.
Yeah.
Well, repeatable one time.
Repeatable one time.
But 3 times.
But 3 times. So yeah, I'd count that as repeatable. But for the purposes of these stats,
Face value.
Analyzing just the face value of the card.
Understood.
So I did a little bit of distribution calculations to see how much weight we give each of these different kinds of ramp across our decks. Surprising no one, permanent were both of our very much highest amount of ramp pieces.
Makes sense. By the time you factor in land ramp, dorks, and rocks, that is most ramp that I suspect all of us play.
Even spells, like, ramp and growth is a permanent ramp spell. Like, you cast it, you get a land, it is huge. So I had 92% of all my ramp across those decks be permanent based, and you had 88%.
This checks out. 9 out of 10. So if there's 10 pieces of ramp in our decks, then in other words, assume that 9 of them are permanent. Yeah. That makes sense to me.
It does make sense to me too. I mean, we'll get into it in a little bit, but there are some really strong reasons why that's the case. Burst ramp, so this is again, reminder, ramp that give you access to more than you should have in a temporary fashion.
Yeah.
3% of my ramp spells were burst.
Okay.
A tiny 0.8% of your ramp was burst.
Which I'm also looking at the table that the patrons are going to see, and I can see that it's 1. I had 1 card in 10 of my decks that was a burst ramp.
I'm now actually even struggling to remember what the burst was.
I can't even think of what I would play that would be burst, but that's funny. So yes, clearly you're a bit hotter on this than me, although not by far. Like, to be fair, your number here is 4 for reference. So,
so it's not much higher. It's like the difference between 1 and 4 across 10 decks.
It's not massive.
It's not huge.
We're not super hot on burst ramp is the conclusion I'm drawing here.
Not in casual commander, no.
Yeah.
Like in CEDH, I'm all about those rituals and dockside extortionists.
Absolutely.
But in casual, it's just is not what we want to be doing.
It's more important for you to have access to continuous ramp,
100%.
having ramp on subsequent turns every subsequent turn.
Very important. Now, the last category, repeatable, I had 6% of my ramp pieces be repeatable, and you had 9%. A little bit higher.
Interesting.
Yeah, you had 11 pieces and I had 9. So not a huge discrepancy there, but like you seem to be a little bit more fascinated by playing with them. And there were like really interesting cards, which when we go into the synergy section of this, there was one particular deck that really loved repeatable ramp.
I think I know the one you're thinking of. I'm interested to talk about that.
But let's talk about this, because like I think that the key thing here to highlight is that 90% roughly, like as on average, 90% of our ramp is permanent based.
Yeah.
Why is that? It's safe.
Yeah.
It's just also the most commonplace. Like most ramp spells that Magic has printed over its time is permanent based ramp. Is like a rampant growth. Is a Rakdos Signet.
Yeah, is a
these
Fintorn
kind of
Owls.
things. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. Look, I think it's very easy as well to have synergies, which I'm sure we're going to go into with your permanent ramp.
Yeah.
Is a big thing. But yeah, I think the absolute main reason is that it's safe and it's consistent, right? Like you will, assuming no one board wipes or no one blows up your land or whatever, you will typically get an extra bit of ramp, an extra bit of mana every one of your turns if you did cast your rampant growth, if you have your Rakdos Signet, if you had your Fintorn Owls. Fintorn Owls, I would say, is the least safe of those 3 permanents.
It's most prone to removal, for sure.
But even so, you might get 3 or 4 turns out of a Fintorn Owls before it gets blown up.
Yeah. And I think there's pros and cons to all of these categories, right? Like, obviously, permanent base ramp is very safe. It's not prone to removal usually. It's always going to give you access to the mana on following turns.
Yeah.
Burst has a huge pro that it can make for very explosive plays.
Yeah.
I think that's probably why I was 3% and you were only 0.8 because I love explosive plays.
Yeah, and I like playing white.
Yes, which doesn't have access to a lot of burst ramp
this
spells.
Is difference between a player who is base red and the player who's base white.
Yeah,
I think
that's kind of funny actually.
Yeah, I'm much more towards these other ways of ramping, and you're like, give me the mana right now.
Yeah.
But that's a huge pro though. Like in the right deck, in Storm decks, for instance, you kind of have to play your Mana Geyser because it's the only way you're going to get that much mana on one turn.
100%. And then like repeatable ramp, these kind of things that can like make you a treasure return or do this. The huge pro, which we'll look into when we talk about synergy, is that can be really synergistic with your deck. Like, especially if it's treasure-based, like making your treasure multiple turns. If you've got treasure synergies, that's huge.
Yeah, if you've got a Disciple of the Vault in your deck, then cracking
massive.
a treasure is now a win con for you. Like, that's... Even that alone is enough of a reason to want to move towards treasures.
100%. So, like, that's kind of like just the kind of ramp that we'll look at. But there is types of ramp, like real specifically. We're going to go into the synergistic piece kind of section now.
Oh, the synergy, sure.
Yes, but to look at this, I really want to talk about the actual kind of ramp. And now we're really going to look at dorks, rocks, spells, cost reducers, these kind of categories. So, quickly for the uninitiated, I'll speed through them. Dorks are creatures that tap for mana. Rocks are usually artifacts that tap for mana or filter mana or something like that. Spells, these are your Farseeks, your Cultivates, these kinds of things. Reducers are things that can reduce the cost of your spells. So, for example, Ethereum Sculptor reduces the cost of artifact spells. Joru's Familiar reduces the cost of historic spells.
There's similar ones for pretty much every card type that exists. There are creature reducers, there are enchantment reducers, everything.
And you know what I found when I was looking at the decks?
What?
They don't all fit neatly into these categories.
No?
There was a huge other category that I had to add when I was looking at these decks.
Okay.
And it's so hard for me to define the other category because there was like such interesting stuff. I mean, like, for example, extra land drops fit into the other category. They're not mana dorks. They're not rocks. They're not spells.
Yeah.
They're ways to get extra lands, which is this repeatable form of ramp.
Sure.
It's really interesting. So let's have a look at the breakdown. Let's have a look at the stats.
Sure.
We'll start with rocks. I had 50 rocks across my decks. For comparison, you had 26.
Wow, literally half.
Yeah,
I had literally half as many.
34% of my ramp pieces are rocks, and 22% of your ramp pieces were rocks.
Wow, that really says it, doesn't it?
That's a huge discrepancy in the data.
Yeah, far out. I mean, yeah, you love rocks. We knew this.
I love rock.
I think you play a lot. You play in a lot more decks that aren't green than me, as well as another thing that I would say.
Which we'll go into for
Yeah,
sure, about
sure.
like the advantages of each and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of dorks, I was actually a lot closer to you than I thought that I would be on this one. I had 10% of my ramp be dorks, and you had 15% of your ramp be dorks.
Trying to think of which decks have the dorks. I know for sure Rith is a big contributor here.
That
There's
was
like
definitely
5
where
or
most of the
6.
count came from.
There's 5 or 6 dorks and then a bunch of spells in that one as well.
Yeah, and it was interesting because like Cryptolith Right turns your creatures into dorks.
Oh, sure. Did you count that as a dork?
It went in the other category.
Okay, that
because
makes sense.
It's not quite a dork.
It is not a dork,
Yeah.
but it does make other creatures dorks. Yeah.
Yes, but it has a lot of really great synergy as well.
Yeah.
Spells, we were almost exactly the same here in terms of percentage distribution. I had 24% and you had 23%.
See, that's so interesting because your rock count is so much higher that I would have thought this would have brought down the percentage of your ramp spells, but evidently my distribution is lying elsewhere. I suppose dorks is already one that we've identified.
And keep in mind as well, you had a lot less ramp in general, so your like percentage range.
Well, no, the percentage should be the same though, right?
Yeah, but statistically the range in which your percentages could fall by adding and subtracting one piece of ramp in each category is smaller.
It has a larger effect.
Yes,
Having a number be 1 greater in my count in any given category
is going to contribute higher
warps
to
my
your
percentage a lot more because there's a lot fewer things being counted. That makes sense. Yeah.
Reducers. This was something I was absolutely shocked on. I only had 4 pieces across mine.
Yeah.
You had 13. That made up 11% of all of your ramp being cost reducers.
Wow.
I was bamboozled. Mine was, for comparison, 3%.
I really just did not think that I really played reducers.
I thought I was the cost reducer guy.
Yeah. That is so
shocked.
interesting.
Gandalf had quite a few.
Oh, that makes sense. There's definitely a Joros Familiar in there.
Yep. There was, I think, a few.
In Estrad, there's 1 or 2 in Estrad at least. Maybe even 3 in Estrad.
I think there was, maybe 3 or 4, actually.
Yeah, okay.
And there might be a 5th coming from Duskmourn. There's that new Azorius enchantment reducer.
Oh, I did see that.
You might throw that in as well.
It's possible, yeah.
But look, and then the other category blew me away. We had the exact same percentage.
Oh.
29% each in other.
Wow.
Which was just weird. I don't know, like, it was just chance that it lined up, but 29% was other spells that we consider ramp, but didn't fit neatly into a rock, a dork, a spell, or a reducer.
This is a very sizable percentage. Like, this, to me...
kind of insane.
I really expected that we could talk about rocks and dorks and ramp spells and sort of feel as though we'd covered every category, but that's only accounting for 70% of our decks. Another 30%
is something
other
else.
stuff happening.
Which
wow.
I was really shocked when I was making the spreadsheet, right, when I was like looking at our decks, I was like, okay, dorks, rocks, reducers, spells, that'll cover me.
Mm-hmm.
By the first deck that I looked at, I was like looking at a spell and I was like,
that's not any of these.
That doesn't count in any of these categories. And I really have never seen any other creators talk about these ways of ramping in this way. Anyway, I wanted to address a bit of not an elephant in the room at this point. It's a bit of an ongoing joke, bit of a meme that I love mana rocks. If you were around in our local game store, there was an expression for a long time called Jamesing all over the place.
Yeah, which was on turn 4, you had 5 mana rocks on the battlefield, basically.
Now, I did a little bit of an analysis on this specifically just because I was really interested. So the question is, does James love mana rocks, or was his Tornos deck just a contributing factor?
Oh, sure, because that's an artifact deck that plays every rock it possibly can.
Yes. So I took out Tornos and analyzed the other 9 decks, and it it did reduce it quite heavily. It produced 27% of all of my ramps being rocks.
It's still significantly higher than mine, but it's a lot closer. It's only 5% higher than mine.
But it would still make it my highest type of ramp in my decks, except for the other category.
Whereas if you were looking at my percentage, I was at 22% on rocks, but I was 23% on ramp spells.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm still higher on that than others. I think this makes a lot of sense. You're playing, in general, more ramp than me.
Yep.
And I would say, in general, less green than me.
Yes.
So I think if you want to play ramp and you're not in green, rocks are just usually the easiest way to get your ramp count
100%.
up. So it makes sense. And I think it suits your playstyle. Again, I think you like explosive plays. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
But it's not wildly different from me, but it's high enough that I'm like, that reflects in my head how
What
I
you
think about
thought.
the way that we play Commander differently.
I think so too. So I think now we should look at when we should include each type of ramp piece in our deck.
Sure.
Because there's many different types, and I think listeners probably, the question is, okay, yeah, there's all these different types, but when should I be looking at each type for each deck?
Reasonable.
So we'll start with rocks, considering that was like the main point of discussion just
Sure.
then. If you have any artifact synergies, like affinity or parent toughness equal to artifacts, or you can untap them with stuff like Winding Clock, this is a huge boon for your deck.
Yeah.
These are also just really helpful, like Walt said, when you don't have access to other good spells or effects in your deck, mostly because of colors.
Yeah.
So green if you're not in green.
Yeah, well, most dorks are in green, most ramp spells are in green. So
Yep.
if you're not in green, you immediately are more reliant on rocks in general. I think I agree. If you have any artifact synergies whatsoever, try to make almost all the ramp in your deck rocks,
Yeah,
I would say.
100%.
But yeah, they are prone to removal. Like, artifact board wipes are getting more common because treasures are so prevalent in the format and because artifacts in general are so prevalent in the format. So yeah, like, don't always assume that all rocks is the best way to go if you're not in green. But yeah, like, most of the time, this is going to be a safe and reliable way to ramp, I think.
For example, my Sally Sparrow deck, I was like, oh, I'm an ETB's deck, and there's lots of white creatures like Knight of the White Orchid that ETB and get me a land. But I ended up cutting all of them because I had more artifact synergies in that deck than land ramp. And I was like, okay, that's where I want to go. Because if I overload a Rise and Shine, all my rocks now become 4/4s.
Yeah.
That feels really strong.
Well, also, if you're not in green and you do have that 4-mana commander that wants to come out early, like Sally Sparrow.
2-drop rocks are perfect.
2-drop rocks, there's so many of them, and they suit your strategy so perfectly that it's very hard. I mean, Knight of the White Orchid is a reasonable replacement, but most of those other, like, get a land out of your deck white cards are 3 or 4 mana.
Like the rabbit one from
The rabbit
Thunder
one
Junction.
is 3 mana. There's the one that gets lands equal to the highest number of lands an opponent could scholarship sponsor.
Yeah,
that's
there's also
4.
Core Cartographer, that's 3
Core
mana.
Cartographer is 4,
Oh, 4
as
mana?
well.
Damn,
yeah,
Jesus,
so most
yeah.
of them are 3 or 4 mana. So yeah,
Yeah.
if you have that specific thing of I want to get my 4-mana commander out early and I'm not in green, so I can't play Rampant Growth, 2-mana rocks are just going to be your way to get
They're
there.
colorless, they go in every deck. But
Yeah.
I will say they are prone to removal. They are a permanent on the battlefield
Yeah.
that if all non-land permanents are blown up,
Yeah.
they go with it.
Well, stuff like Austere Command is getting really, really commonly played, I think,
Yeah.
because, we have to answer artifacts more and more these days. So
And I will say as well, I think rocks can be a little bit annoying to sequence
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. I think sometimes it's annoying to look at your hand and go, oh, I can't cast this rock because by the time I cast it, I don't have the right amount of mana to cast this other spell in my hand.
Yeah.
It's the same with all ramp, I think.
Yeah.
But I think people trick themselves into thinking that they can sequence rocks cleverly. And then sometimes late game, they'll try and, maybe they've drawn a ton of cards and they'll go, oh, I'll drop all my mana rocks because then I'll be great in my next turns.
Yeah.
And then they look at how much mana they have left and they've not got enough to win the game.
Yeah. I think the other thing with rocks is that there's a decent amount of really, really good ones. But when you start trying to build a deck and you specifically want like every 2-mana rock that you can get your hands on in your colors, and you're a 2-color deck, you fairly quickly start having to play some kind of bad cards. You start having to play things like diamonds, which always enter tapped.
I've cut diamonds from every deck now.
Yeah.
I really don't like
There's
diamonds
There's
anymore.
just so many better options these days. Like you can have your obviously what's one that turns things into artifacts. Liquid Metal Talk
That's great.
is an absolutely outstanding ramp spell. But then even like a Mind Stone can sometimes be better than a diamond
Even
in some
just
cases.
like a Cold Steel Heart.
Yeah,
Enters
Cold Steel
tapped,
Heart, but you can have multiple colors that
colours,
you choose with Cold Steel Heart. Yeah, I even find in 2-color decks specifically, 1 color even better. There's that card, Star Compass.
Oh, yeah,
Enters
yeah.
tapped, and it taps for a mana of any color that your basic lands could produce. So you
it's
have to have a
almost
pretty good basic count.
But it's also just a good fixer as well. Like
Yeah.
if as long as you've got all of your colors represented, it fixes you more than you already are.
And it's better than a diamond in
Yeah.
90% of cases, I would say.
100%.
Yeah.
Now, the next category was dorks. So these are great if you want a high creature count, obviously. If you're running Beast Whisperer, you should be on dorks.
Absolutely.
If you can win the game with effects like Overwhelming Stampede, now your like Finhorn Elves isn't just a ramp piece, but your Llanowar Elves can now also trample over someone's blockers and kill someone and win the game. So they're not only ramping you, but they're progressing your board state. However, they are very prone to removal.
Oh, yeah. Like, I know we said Austere Command and stuff gets played. They still don't get played nearly as often as just Wrath of God effects, Blasphemous Act effects. Your dorks will get blown up. Like, it's not even a question of like, oh, I wonder whether they will be. No, they will be blown up.
And sometimes there can be a bit of a benefit to the fact that they're, quote, prone to removal, because early game, you cast a Llanowar Elves, and then someone is playing a very aggro deck and they're swinging at you, and you're like, ooh, I actually have a block available to me here.
This was a big argument in Sam Black's original thing way back, probably actually when we did Mana Curvy, and we looked at Sam Black's thoughts on Mana Rocks.
15 years ago.
Yeah, his thoughts on Mana Rocks. A big part of that was that he felt that in non-green decks, it was a real hindrance to not have access to blockers, basically, in the form of dorks.
And it can really, you can see it in your life total. Especially, playing the colors that I play. I have been called multiple times at my play group the Is It punching bag.
Yeah.
Because a lot of players will have creatures on turn 3 that they can swing with.
And you have not deployed creatures yet because you've been playing rocks.
And they're just like, well, it's a free attack. I'll just hit you. It's
People won't
easy.
not attack because it doesn't do anything. It'll be like, no, I'll cast Lightning Bolt on James for free.
Yeah, why
if
not?
I can. Why wouldn't I?
Now, spells is the next category, like Cultivate. These are incredibly safe from removal. They're getting you lands. They can fix you really, really well.
Yep.
Especially a Farseek can get you a Triome.
Yeah.
This is really strong fixing. However, unless you're in a landfall deck, usually very little synergy with your deck.
It's true. I think the thing about the land spells, I would say, is if you are in colors that have access to them, so namely green, and none of the other categories of ramp synergize with your decks, just choose these.
It's so easy.
It's so easy that nobody's blowing up lands. I'm sorry. In Casual Commander, no one's doing it that you want to be playing with anyway. And so, it's the safest, it's reliable, it fixes your colors. There are so few downsides except for the synergy thing. So if you have synergy with rocks, absolutely play rocks. If you'd rather have dorks, play dorks. But in the absence of those things, if those things don't matter to you, there's no synergy there, just play Cultivate, just play Farseek, just play Nature's Law.
One of my favorite things about looking at this section when I was investigating these decks is the only deck that had synergy with these spells was your Catilda and Lear deck. Because you can flash them back. And I was like, yes, Walt did it. He made Rampant Growth synergistic with his commander. Well done, buddy.
I mean, I guess if you're a landfall deck, they can synergize.
I was looking at my 5 life deck being like, obviously Rampant Growth synergizes, where I'm like, actually, this is a really cool and creative way.
Yeah, I play everyone that I can.
Yeah, 100% you should.
Catilda and Lear plays Nature's Law, it plays 3 Visits, it plays Rampant Growth, it plays Farseek. Because, the low-cost ones are the ones that you want to flashback from your bin.
It's crazy.
Feels really good.
Reducers was the other category. Now, these are often very strong because often over the course of a game can actually give you the most amount of acceleration. So if you're reducing your spells by 1 and over 5 turns you've cast 6 spells, you've actually saved 6 mana.
Yeah.
So that 2 mana cost reducer has ramped you 6 effectively.
Well,
that's pretty strong compared to Rampant Growth, right? It always and only will ever ramp you 1.
Yeah, it never gets better than that. But in some cases, reducers can get a lot better. I mean, I couldn't say for a fact that I suspect the deck you looked at that had my highest amount of reducers was probably my Estra deck.
Yes, lots of enchantment reducers.
It's because there's something like 40 enchantments in that deck, and most of them are really cheap. So rather than paying 2 for an enchantment, if you're paying 1 every single time, Yeah, over the course of 3 or 4 turns, I might cast 10 enchantments.
And that's like usually 5 extra spells than what you would usually cast if you cast a permanent based ramp spell over
Absolutely.
this reducer.
I've saved 10 mana where over 3 turns, if I played a 2 mana ramp spell, I've saved what? 4 mana from 4 turns? Like
that's insane.
Yeah, it can be absolutely amazing, but you really need to consider how many of the things you have that it will reduce.
Yeah, that's the downside, right? Like, a rampant growth will always give you access to a land which can cast any spell, except Hogak, apparently. But like, it can cast any spell, but like a reducer that reduces historic spells can't reduce the cost of your sorceries.
Yeah, your instants and your sorceries are not going to do anything.
Unless they're legendary.
Yes, true. They exist.
True, yeah.
But yeah, in general, you got to be really careful about the reducers that you include. And basically, you'll know when to include one because you'll be like, is this an enchantment deck?
Yeah.
Is this an artifact deck?
Is this a spellslinger deck? Because like, there's all these goblin electromancers running around and stuff like that.
Wizards of Thay has been so amazing every time I've seen it recently. Like, it's always been great, but it's gotten better,
slowly becoming a pet card of ours. I'm slotting it into more decks than...
I think I've got it in a couple of decks. You've got it in a couple of decks for sure. It's a really strong card.
The other cool thing about reducers as well is they can combo. Reducing the cost of reiterate can lead to infinite reiterates, which is pretty cool. Reducing artifacts like, the classic Sensei's Top bolus and an artifact reducer.
That's true. That's a win con right there.
Classic combo. Like, I think that there are some homes for reducers in the space of win conditions as well, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, finally, the other category.
The other woman.
The other woman, the thing that we can't quite define, but she's there. This was really hard to put my thumb on. So the thing that I found that was a bit of a common trend was that they're usually the repeatable type of ramp, right? So that from the last section that we were talking about.
Kind, yeah. So they're repeatable. Okay.
Usually. But I think just looking at some examples would really help us here. Now, not super repeatable, but there are lands that can ramp you. Mm-hmm. There is Myriad Landscape.
Yep.
There's Blighted Woodland.
Yep.
These are great, especially if you can recur them from the graveyard. Mm-hmm. These can be really, really strong. I've already mentioned it before, but extra land drops were really, really great. Like Azusa Lost But Seeking, Exploration, Mina and Den. These are really strong.
The caveat here being, you've got to make sure you've got enough lands either in your hand or in your graveyard, in some cases with Azusa, to repeatedly use Azusa, right?
Correct.
Just having Azusa and then playing 2 lands is not usually enough.
So now, because when we looked at the stats, let me just scroll back up here to see the exact numbers. We had the exact same amount of other categories.
29%.
But I found your deck so much more interesting. There was one in my decks that I was like, I really want to call this one out because it's been really strong. In my Sally Sparrow deck, Inspiring Statuary was a piece of ramp that is not a rock.
No.
It's not a reducer.
No.
It's not a dork. It's not a spell. But it's a way that I can use all the clues that I'm generating to improvise spells out, which is kind of ramping me when you think about it.
Absolutely it is. I mean, I would directly draw a comparison here to Cryptolith Rite. I think it's a very similar thing. When you have developed your board, it turns your board into more ramp.
Yeah.
This card's been busted when I've seen it. There was that game the other day when you had a Academy Manufactor.
Oh, yeah.
And then you made a bunch of clues, which made a bunch of food, which made a bunch of treasures.
That was one of our Patreon games. I remember that. That was a cracked game.
Inspiring Statuary. I think you had 9 of each of the 3 different categories.
So I had 9 extra mana.
No, you had 27 because you had 9 clues, 9 food, and 9 treasures.
I did too, yeah.
It is only generic / colorless mana that you can reduce it with.
And it's also only able to cast non-artifact spells specifically.
So it's limited in its scope for sure. It's not like the best card that's ever been printed ever. But in that deck, it was pretty cooked.
It's kind of insane. I wish that it allowed you to use it to activate abilities. So I could activate abilities of clues and stuff. But like, that deck, the Sally Sparrow deck, has stuff like Astral Dragon, which is 6 blue, right? So there's 8 mana, splashy top-end spell. If I can use all my clues to pay for that 6 generic mana and just tap 2 islands, and then leave myself all the rest of my lands,
which in your deck is usually like flicker spells, which keep your board safe.
Yeah, that's really, really strong.
Yeah,
and like it's kind of wild to me that like we always go, oh yeah, mana dorks, rocks, reducers, and all this kind of stuff. But really, when we think about the ramp that is so influential on a game and can really impact a board state, it's kind of the other category, right? It's usually these spells like a Cryptolith Rite in your Rith deck.
Yeah, that can be game ending.
You can like develop your board and you can go, all right, my turn, let's say it's turn 6 or 7. You've developed your board, you've got a bunch of tokens, you go untap, upkeep, you've got maybe 7 mana worth of lands. For 2 mana, you cast Cryptolith Rite. Let's say you've got 15 tokens. You've just burst yourself ahead into 15 extra mana than you would have had.
It's wild. Like, they're ramp spells, definitely. Often more temperamental ramp spells that require more hoops to jump through, but they're ramp spells that can win you the game.
Yes.
And that's really saying something, for sure.
Now, the deck that I wanted to call out specifically for this weird category of other types of ramp was your Barbala Saga deck.
I knew it. I knew it would be Baba.
This deck has some absolutely bonkers ways of ramping. Now, keep in mind, Barba was one of the lower end of the ramp spells.
Well, because it's got a really low curve. I think it's like 2.8 or something.
And I think the ramp count was a 9 or potentially a 10. I think it might have been a 9, actually. Yeah. But you had some great pieces for that deck specifically that was so synergistic. One of the ones that I absolutely loved was Eudora.
Yeah, this is the one that when your non-token creatures die, they return to the battlefield face down, but they're forests.
So you can't classify that as a dork. You can't classify that as a spell, but it is so good in your deck because you are sacking non-token creatures.
And also, you specifically want to sack things with 3 different card types, and now you've got a land to sacrifice that then goes to your bin and is a creature that you could bring back with another reanimate kind of effect. Yeah.
It's kind of insane. Another really great one was Walking Atlas. Not so much really synergistic, but it's another card that I really like as like an extra land drop every turn kind of spell.
Really huge in Barba specifically because you draw cards so well. And I just found that lands were getting stranded in your hand. And because you're sacking them so much of the time as well, you kind of need to have like a certain number of them. But you don't really want to play ramp spells. Yeah, Walking Atlas in decks that draw heaps of cards, in other words, that will always be able to tap it and drop an extra land every turn. I really rate it. I think it's sick.
Another card that I pointed out or like highlighted that was similar to like my boxing ring in my Ayula deck was Undercity Scrounger, I think, or Scavenger. This is the one that you can tap to create a treasure as long as a creature you control died this turn.
Yeah, it's a wild card. Honestly, the big part of the reason that this made the cut in my deck is because it's actually an artifact creature. And so you can sack it to Barba and it counts as 2 card types already. But yeah, also just making a treasure pretty much every turn that Barba is out because you're always going to be sacking stuff with Barba.
I also love the idea of managing to get instill energy on this and being able to make 2 treasures a turn.
I had not thought of that. That's a fun use for that. Usually instill energy is going on Barba, I think.
That's true.
Yeah, it could be good there too.
It might be like a line.
Definitely.
And finally, one of the cards that I really liked in Barba was, is it Enerus or Ernerus?
Erinus, I think, or Arenas. I'm not sure. This is
the one that when it attacks, it returns a land from graveyard to the battlefield.
Yeah, it's a 3/3 with Death Touch. It's from Battle for Baldur's Gate. It's a D&D character, I think, because it's like a halfling rogue or something.
That's right, yeah.
But yeah, attacks and brings a land back. Again, great in Barba because you're sacking land.
Exactly, right?
But yeah.
I just really like the fact that you've managed to build, because you could have very easily, especially in green, you're in green-black in that deck, you could have very easily gone, right, 10 pieces of ramp, I'm going to just put in Cultivate, Farseek.
And then a bunch of dorks.
And a few dorks.
Or a couple of rocks.
Yeah, a couple of rocks here and there and done. But like the fact that you have Eudora in this deck, it's not only ramp, it's part of the game plan.
Yeah.
And it's really, like I've seen that card progress your board state to a point of this unbeatable engine of value. And it's like, unbelievable to watch.
Yeah.
And it's a ramp spell. I think people look at ramp and go, wow, boring.
Yeah.
It's Cultivate. I don't care.
This other category, they can be some of the most fun and impactful spells in your deck in certain cases. Yeah, it's really fun.
They can. Look, alongside every other Commander content creator, we have recommended an amount of ramp that we suggest when building a deck. However, by thinking about it a little bit deeper than just the amount and asking questions such as, what kind of ramp should I use? Is it synergistic? Might actually result in not only you ramping just your mana, but yourself into the lead of the game, and it might just be the reason you get your next win. So, Space Commanders,
command received.
Interesting, right?
Yeah.
A bit of a deep dive on the kind of ramp we use was a lot more eye-opening than I thought when looking into this command.
I always enjoy these deck principle episodes because it really makes me think about why we build the decks the way that we do. And I'm really glad that we build decks so differently because that becomes a lot of the interest in talking about stuff.
Yeah, it's good that we've got a podcast. It's good that we do that
Yeah.
and have a podcast
Yeah.
because it would be really boring if we both went, no, we have the exact same opinion.
Yeah, boring.
Put 10 pieces of ramp and
Yeah.
just always use cultivate.
Yeah.
It's the exact thing.
Ugh, yuck. Anyway, we have a podcast because it's people like you, listeners. Do you feel commanded? What do you think of ramp? And what's your average ramp count across all of your decks?
Yeah, I'm curious. Are you as high as me, or are you a Sam Black-esque type player? And
Looking at you, Fletcher. I know you're out there.
Yeah, for sure. Look, you can tell us on all those social platforms at Get Commanded, on Twitter and Instagram and stuff. But best place to talk to us would be live in our Twitch channel while we're playing with other amazing content creators like Attack on Cardboard and Cozy Magic Club. Twitch.tv/Get Commanded. And then you can watch that content later on our YouTube channel as well, which, by the way, is where all of our monthly Meteor video podcasts go. So make sure to go subscribe.
Wink, wink.
Yeah, it might be coming.
It looks like we're in another month.
It's another month. It's a monthly Meteor. You should definitely go subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already.
Definitely. We also would be lost, of course, without our patrons over on Patreon. You can check it out in the show notes. It's the absolute best way to support the Get Commanded podcast directly. We'd like to thank our patrons Fuzzy, Bottomless Potamus, Dyer, Dylan Norg, Bertie, Crazy Logic, Benjamin, and Henry Solis. We'd also like to make a special shout out to Fletcher Cutting and Wizard Down Under who support us in the Space Commander tier. You are the best.
You are the best. And thanks for getting it back to us on Patreon, Henry.
Yeah.
Thanks again to Palms Off Gaming for sponsoring this podcast. These guys are the creators of the amazing Genesis deck box, the blackout sleeves, the amazing limited edition, ridiculous amount of pocket binders.
That thing is so silly.
It's ridiculous. I still haven't finished transferring all of my trades into the binder. It's like, because now I've got more room, I'm putting more trades in my binder, but it's getting really heavy now.
Oh my god!
I think they need to either create a dolly, like a binder dolly that you can bring to the game store.
I don't know if we need it. I'm starting to suspect that the reason that the binder is black is because it's actually, in fact, a black hole.
Yeah,
you can just put infinite cards in there.
If you just throw it into the middle of a game store, the gravity is so intense it will suck everyone else's trades into your binder. Please don't quote us on that. Not a feature of the product. You
Check out the actual ad and not our one.
You can go to palmsoffgaming.com.au/GetCommanded to get 10% off store-wide and you support the podcast at the same time. So palmsoffgaming.com.au/#GetCommanded.
Yeah, that's all the magic stuff we have. I reckon we better planeswalk out of here somewhere outside of Magic, outside of Commander. James, it's your turn.
Yeah, we're just going to my house today.
Your house?
Not been doing an awful lot. For those that have been focusing on Discord and my updates, I've been incredibly sick the past couple of weeks. Been in and out of just resting, but I'm back at full health. And this weekend, Theo and I, mostly Theo, because I don't have a fashionable bone in my body, but we've been redecorating our house a little bit.
Oh, cool.
Or just decorating, just getting some extra things. We got a living room rug, which...
that's such a nice touch.
Yeah, especially considering we got floorboards.
Yes, and rats.
Yes, and rats now. And also we decorated the rats cage as well, so that they've got a whole new playground array of. They've got a wooden ladder in there now.
Oh, cute! Love that.
But yeah, we got some new shelves. We got some new sunset lamps. Got a salt lamp. Got just a bunch of stuff. And I just kind of wanted to. It's not a very big planeswalk this week, but the difference it's made in the living environment in our living room is huge. It's like, it feels like a new house.
Yeah.
And it feels cozier. I feel more incentivized. Like, I did a lot of this research, not at my desk. I did it in our lounge room because I was just kind of I did it on my laptop on the couch because I was like, I just kind of want to be in this room now.
It's amazing the difference that even just lighting makes. Just having soft, indirect,
lamps,
diffused light. Yeah, lamps. Salt lamps are really great for that. Sunset lamps also really good for that. It's just so calming for everybody. Like people with, accessibility requirements, people who find overhead lights really overstimulating. That's reason enough to include this kind of lighting in your house. But also, it's just that classic example of accessibility that helps everyone. Like no one loses out when you live in an environment that has nice, warm lighting.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's healthier because,
it is.
like, at the end of the day, if you have big overhead fluorescent lights on, your brain is stimulated at the end of the day when you should be winding down. So when you're watching TV, you're taking a bunch of information in and all of your lights are on. So you're very, like, aware. And then getting into bed, like, going like, okay, all done with today, gonna go into bed, turn the lights off, and now you're like in pitch black going from very bright. It's hard for your brain to make that transition.
Well, blue light really keeps you awake. It's why blue light blockers are such a thing. And white light or cool light that you have contains more blue than warm orange lights do. Now
that we've got these like really nice lamps and sunset lamps, we don't. Yeah, the overhead lights just don't go on.
Yeah.
And it's just so much nicer and more comfortable to be in a living environment like that.
Good. I can't wait to come over and visit now.
Yeah, well, I'll have to host a Commander Night show.
You'll have to. All right, that's all we have time for. We'll see you next Friday for another transmission from the Space Commanders.
Goodbye, Commander players.
Bye, Rampers.